All right, we're jumping back in. We just finished up with this slide right here in our last presentation where we talked about how to measure spiritual maturity. And then we ended up pointing you towards this, what we call 5 levels of ministry programming. So I wanted to jump into the 5 levels of ministry programming and walk you through these. Hopefully in this session, it may break into 2 sessions for part 1 and part 2 for number 11. What we're looking at is 5 different levels of ministry programming, and when we get started with that, we start with what we call relationship building. And relationship building is something that can be so simple, but yet sometimes it can be overlooked in its intentionality and its purpose. And we got to be careful that we don't do that. If you look in your Bibles at Matthew chapter 9, starting in verse 10, it reads, "While he was reclining at the table in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came as guests to eat with Jesus and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, 'Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?'" Now listen to Jesus' response. And also notice what Jesus was doing with these folks. "But when he heard this, he said, 'Those who are well don't need a doctor, but the sick do. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners.'" Now understand that when we're talking about relationship building, we're getting into an initial level of pre-evangelism. Pre-evangelism is best accomplished through building relationships with the unbeliever and those around us that don't know the gospel, don't have a relationship with Christ. And relationship building, though, is something that we do to demonstrate our concern and our care for people just because they're made in the image of God, because they are His creation, because they are His people. It's true that they're people from whom Christ died, but this tends to, sometimes we start looking past who they are as a person and only at their souls. We know that ultimately their souls will live forever, and that people have a place where they will be forever, whether it's with God or without God, whether it's in heaven or eternally separated from Him. And so when we think about relationship building, it's not just a means to an end. Relationship building is part of the process of an ultimate goal of seeing those come to know Christ and embrace the gospel message that He has sacrificed Himself for us to have. But we got to see them as people. And when you value people, then you value relationship. And when you value relationship, it gives you the opportunity to speak into their lives with the gospel. Sometimes the secular humanist has a greater appreciation for relationship building. In fact, sometimes people who are so focused on people's needs are kinder than Christians and believers in certain circles. Let me give you a little bit of example here. We've got the humanist versus the Christian. Humanists are this world oriented, so they're thinking about how to improve people's lives right now. Christians are other world oriented. Sometimes there's a disconnect between the two. We need to find that balance between the two, where we find that we need to attend to needs in this world, but we need to understand that the ultimate goal is something that's far beyond our existence here and what God has for us. Number 2 is that the humanist lives for the now. And right here and right now, the Christians are supposed to be living for eternity, living for future glory, and so we see this in their lives and how there's a different perspective in how we approach relationship building. But with this model, we want you to understand that relationship building is done with no ulterior motives. There's no higher motivation than right then and there in that moment. And it's not just something we do to fill time and space. It has an intentional purpose. It doesn't separate me from being a Christian. I'm known as a Christian, so Christianity may be a topic, but the ultimate goal for relationship building is pre-evangelistic. It's laying a foundation. But because of our Christian identity, it may lead to an evangelistic encounter, and that's fine. But pre-evangelism doesn't include, in a programming sense, a gospel presentation as the goal. The goal is to build relationships and lay a foundation to conversion. Okay, so the biblical characteristic aim is just that: foundation to convert. So you're tilling up the ground. You're helping to apply biblical truth and to lead them to the power of the gospel and see how God has already been seeking them out and preparing them. The audience aim is to the closed unbeliever. How best can we see the gospel presented to those who don't know Him and are closed to Him than just by caring for them and just by having a relationship? Letting them see that Christians are not just people who speak about the gospel and speak about living right and obeying the Bible, but we're people who care about people just for who they are, regardless of their response to the gospel. That's what Jesus did in Matthew chapter 9 that we just read. What are some examples of relationship building? Well, you've got casual contacts. In other words, you need to be where students are hanging out: ball games, concerts, malls, practices, wherever they hang out. Number two, there are planned events, and I'm borrowing some terms that are probably universal and very generic. You can get more creative with these, but pizza blasts and McDonald's, anything. And when I say McDonald's, I mean hang out where kids hang out. You can have a planned event where you're going to say, hey, we're going to meet with a group of kids and we're not going to have a Bible study. We're just going to go and get McFlurries at McDonald's. And you do that on a regular basis. Maybe you open it up if people have questions about the Bible or about the church, and you're welcome to come join us. Anything the church might approve for this purpose is great. But there are some pitfalls to pre-evangelism and relationship building, because one of the greatest pitfalls that I've seen is that sometimes in a student ministry we can overemphasize relationship building and never evangelize. In fact, a lot of times I've seen student ministries and youth pastors have traditional events that generate a lot of excitement but never really go anywhere. But they don't want to change them because it generates a lot of excitement, and there's a perception of growth and activity, and they want to keep that going even after the fact. And so it's really a major concern that when you overemphasize without evangelism, in other words, sometimes relationship building can be used without a purpose. Go figure. But it has to have a purpose. And so relationship building has to lay a foundation to a convert. Number two, there's a neglect for committed youth. When you're spending so much time on those who don't know Christ or at a very introductory level of their walk with Christ, or even not there yet, sometimes we neglect the students who are committed in their walk with Christ. And number three, that we have ulterior motives. In other words, we want something other than friendship or to build the relationship. Sometimes maybe we are trying to develop a website, or maybe we're trying to make connections so that we can get into a school function, or have better connections with a football team, or maybe we need somebody who's a musician that can play in a band, and we're okay if they would just come, and so we get to know them for reasons other than just the relationship to lay the foundation for a convert. So those are some of the pitfalls. Second, in our 5 levels of programming, is outreach or evangelism. In Acts chapter 10, verses 1 through 15, I'm not going to read all of these verses. In fact, I'm not going to read any of them. But you may recall the story. It's the story of Peter, and Peter is challenged by God through a dream to go to Cornelius and to begin to allow the gospel to be delivered to the Gentiles. And praise God that was a reality, and that God did that, because otherwise most of us that are listening to this and will ever be in the church, many of us would never have received the gospel. But outreach is the focus, and the purpose of the outreach level or evangelism level is to share the gospel by design. I mean, that's the outcome of this activity. Evangelism that results from pre-evangelism is lifestyle. So when you build a relationship, and that's pre-evangelism, when evangelism happens, you may have an actual event, but the evangelism that we really would love to see happen is that students and leaders have built relationships with the lost and are able, through that activity, that event, that environment that you facilitate, share the gospel. And it may be a platform, presentation of the gospel as well, but also that it can be something that can be identified in the lifestyle of those who have built relationships with the lost. Evangelism that begins, though, at this level, level 2. When it begins at level 2, when there's no foundation to a convert, it's what we call confrontation evangelism. In other words, there's a short ramp to the presentation of the gospel. If it begins at the first level, relationship building, you have a longer lead-in, longer time for the lost and those who aren't saved to get to know Christians, and for Christians to be able to invest in the lives of those and to earn a right to be heard. But when it begins, evangelism begins at level 2, it's confrontation evangelism. The biblical characteristic aim is conversion. I mean, that's just very simply put, it's conversion. And the audience aim is now the open unbeliever. With relationship building, it's focused on the closed unbeliever. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't build relationships with unbelievers who are open to the gospel. You still do. I mean, that's what Jesus did. But it's to the open unbeliever. But there are some examples of level 2. We could, and from a programming perspective, Sunday school could be a great example of level 2. Now, some of us don't use our Sunday school for evangelism. Some of us don't believe we should. We should focus in on the growth of the believing students and Christians, and that's okay. But it is an option. Visiting, following up, going to homes, following up on students, visiting them where they are. Camps. in my 2+ decades of doing local church youth ministry in various states and churches, we have always tried to use camp for outreach, to invite the lost to come to camp and do whatever we can to minimize the cost. Campus clubs, where we do involve students in helping to reach their campus and have weekly meetings on campus to be able to reach their peers. Then there's also events. Kings Island is in this region in the state of Virginia that I live in, and Kings Island or amusement parks. You have Kentucky Kingdom, which is in Louisville, and all kinds of parks. I'm sorry, Kings Island is in Cincinnati. But using events where you take kids to amusement parks together, concerts, sporting events, using different kinds of events for presenting the gospel. But there are some pitfalls, and some of them are similar. One of the pitfalls is where you have a program for evangelism, but it's very impersonal, and you see them coming together, and you invite students to be there only as a number. So the more you have there, the more the higher the percentage of those who would receive the gospel would be. And that's not necessarily true, especially if there's impersonal evangelistic strategies being employed. If you don't capitalize on the relationships, and even in that moment seek to build relationships and invest in order to invite to the event, as well as invest to invite someone to respond to the gospel. So there's a pitfall there. And then there's also a pitfall of failing to follow up. My word, that is just a basic of ministry, to follow up. Someone visits one time, there ought to be a phone call. There ought to be a follow-up, a visit, a note, a card, an email. There are different levels of follow-up, but I would rate those in order of importance. The most personal to the least personal is the order in which you should go. But in the end, you've got to employ one of those. There needs to be follow-up. Number 3, the third level of our programming 5 levels, is growth. And with growth, we start looking at understanding what it means to number 1, to as you're leading them up to conversion, then they become a believer, and then we start the growth process. 1 Timothy 4 and verse 12 says, "Let no one despise your youth. Instead, you should be an example to the believers in speech and conduct, in love and in faith and in purity. Until I come, give your attention to public reading, exhortation, and teaching." Well, that's straight drilled down the middle of what growth is all about. It's helping them to live out their faith. Be an example of that. And the only way you're an example of something is if you have studied and been taught what it means to be an example in that context. So growth is the elementary stage in the discipleship process. You say, well, I thought conversion would be. Well, no, in the discipleship process, growth is the elementary stage. It's the beginning of learning what it means to be a Christ follower. And it takes place primarily in corporate or group settings. Now, I know one-on-one discipleship is great, and you still need those one-on-one contexts and interactions. But if you look back through the Gospels, most of what we see in the model that Jesus gave us is in a group context. Sometimes it's just 2 or 3. Every once in a while, he singles somebody out. But in many of those situations where he singles someone out, it's in the context of a group as well, although he speaks specifically to a person. So we need to understand that it takes place in a group setting primarily. The biblical characteristic aim is the churched. And someone who's craving the word. If you remember those biblical characteristic aims, there was conversion, then churched, and craving the word. Our target audience then is the convert and the new believer, to see them develop in this way. Some examples. Sunday school, once again. Bible study is a great example. Some corporate events. You could do retreats, discipleship weekends, DNOW weekends, lock-ins. Some pitfalls, though, is that we disciple without evangelism. We forget the front end of this equation. We forget that there not only needs to be evangelism or discipleship, but it has to follow evangelism and then circle back around. Well, we come to number 4. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 2 says, says, "And what you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, commit to faithful men who will be able to teach others also." The level 4, the purpose is to develop spiritual maturity through a commitment in action. In other words, you've been discipled, now go and practice what you've learned. They provide the commitment, and you provide the action. In other words, you need to have a strategy to work out their commitment. There should be a verbal or written commitment to the standards and leadership of your student ministry as an example. They should be local church standards that are expected of those in leadership positions anywhere in the church. You may have a contract for a specific action or a task, like one-on-one discipleship, or for a specific event. The biblical characteristic aim, though, is compassion and consecration, those final two C's, C's 4 and 5. The audience aim is the young, established believer in this equation.